He was looking for one night's shelter. He would find a family instead. The canyon was a clean, merciless thing at dusk. Rock faces bled the last of the sun into narrow ribbons. Wind slid like a blade across the benches, and the sky above the rim went the color of old pewter. Tayer Reding walked with the slow, stubborn rhythm of a man who had chosen his path and kept walking. A leg that never truly healed throbbed inside a boot rimmed with dust. His coat was the color of dried grass, his canteen at his hip sounded empty, and his hands were mapped with old scars. Small white rivers that spoke of a life measured in rope and barbed wire, and a dozen winters of hard work. He watched the canyon like a man who had learned the way the land read you. He listened for coyotes and the hiss of distant hooves. He kept his mouth shut against conversations that had no place in the desert. The names he had not spoken for 2 years, the small voice of a son who had died into fever. Memory lived in fragments. A cupped hand, a bed without breath, a chair kept warm for a body that did not return. He carried them like a weight under his ribs, and they slowed him more than the leg ever would. The light curve of the canyon finally disclosed a fire, small, careful. 3 stones ringed around a slow burn, smoke that smelled of piñon and the sweet dry scent of meat. There were 3 figures folded against the heat, women with shoulders set against the night, their hair braided, the lines of their faces carved by sun and work. For a long moment they might have been rock. Then one of them lifted her chin and looked at him. He did not have the right to ask. He did not bother to say where he had been or why his boot was caked in red clay. He only straightened, took off his hat out of a habit that would not die, and kept his hands where they could be seen. "Sit," said the woman who had watched him. Asha, he would later learn the sound of her name as if it fit the shape of her face. Her voice was low and direct. She spoke in broken Spanish when she thought speed better than ceremony. "Una noche." 1 night, she meant. Her eyes were bright with calculation. She was the first to test him because she looked the sort that had to measure everything once and then trust nothing without proof. He sat. He accepted the cup she passed, water, boiled with a leaf of some bitter herb that left his tongue rough but grateful. He drank carefully, every swallow a small vow. At the fire his shadow looked too large for the man who carried it. The women did not crowd him. They kept their backs to the stone, and their shoulders aligned like a single line of watchmen. The second woman watched him without hurried motion, the ease of someone who had been forced into patience. Nayali, her braid down her back, the hair threaded with a thin strip of woven leather, handled the pot and the bandage roll with the attention of a person who understood small stitches and long recoveries. When she handed a second cup, she said nothing. Her eyes were not cold. They were a quiet storehouse. Where Asha tilted toward clarity and demand, Nayali held nuance and the old ways of doing things gently but firmly. The youngest, Nomi, sat with her knees drawn up and a blanket over her calves. She glanced at Tayer and then away, like a child learning to watch an animal and not frighten it. She was cautious in the soft kind of way that had been practiced into her, one thin scar at the corner of her mouth that could have been the result of a fall or a flame. She moved as if the world might be less dangerous if she kept her hands busy. When she reached to tuck a stray curl back from Nayali's face, she did so with the secrecy of someone who was tending the world by keeping it small. They allowed him 1 night because they had reasons to be wary. The canyon was a place where strangers passed and then were gone, where hurt men sometimes took refuge and then left trouble. They let him sit by the fire, eat the meat they had caught, and sleep under a single patched blanket by the rocks at the outer ring. They told him the rules by way of glances and short words. He could not read Apache customs. None of them explained the deeper edges. They did not have to. The sense of economy, food for hands, fire for work, watch for danger, ruled the place the way gravity rules the land. Only 1 night, Asha repeated in Spanish, then in accented English. Her accent was not theatrical, it was a geography. 1 night, and you leave come morning. He nodded because there was nowhere else he would go, and because he had learned that a promise made without a watch was not a promise at all. He slept with the leg bunched under him, favoring it like an insulted limb. Memory arrived in the small hours. His wife's laugh as she fetches a bowl, a thin voice calling for a bottle and then silence, a fever that filled the house and took both of them in the end. His son's small fist, the way it had once tightened around his thumb to prove that he was there. He had been a man without a horizon since that winter. Night had hollowed out his inside until it became a room you could walk through and find only echoes. When dawn came, it came with a color so clean it could be frightening, blue that did not relent, air that bit at the throat. He woke before the others and watched them move, hands that had ways of setting stones so the wind did not eat the smoke, motions that were not wasted. He boiled water for them and branched an ash twig into a spit with the patience of a man who had built fences in a dozen places. He surprised himself with the efficiency of his hands. The women watched. Asha watched as if watching measured a man and not only his labor. Nayali watched to see if the man would pity them or if he would join them at the level of work. Nomi watched to know whether this figure would be steady in the common, unnoticed hours. They fed him again. The fire softened him. Conversation came slow like milk rolling off a spoon. The men who had been in their houses, what had taken them, it came out in fits. Nayali, who kept the small things of healing near her, told him, simply, without flourish, that raiders had burned their houses where earlier generations had stood. They had learned to move. Asha said the word raiders like it was a rusted gate, something that opened and closed, and did not notice the names of the things it crushed. Nomi sometimes could not look, because looking could unravel the part of herself that pretended the world had not been cruel. There was no plaintive pleading in their telling. They were stating facts that had bent them but not broken them. They had lost husbands and brothers. They had lost tools and animals. They had losses that lived in the elasticity of their hands and the way they fixed a pot rim with a bent nail. The telling made them neither victims nor martyrs. It made them people who had stepped forward and stacked their days together and kept life working. Tayer listened and felt something deepen and press at his chest. He did not offer a sermon. He had no words that would set their world back in motion. He only said his name and the small truth of where he had come from. An ex-rancher, a man whose family had died to fever. His voice was even, the way of men who had learned to keep their voice as a tool, not as a bleeding on the floor. "Why are you still here?" he asked once, because wonder makes itself known hollow and blunt. It was a question not of pity, but of practical curiosity. Why make a home in a place that was useful to enemies? Asha answered with the look of someone who balanced patience and practicality like stones. "Because the canyon keeps the light, because the ground has springs where roads do not, because we are not done with our lives." Her Spanish slipped in. "No acabamos," she said. Then she translated by the motion of her hands. Asha's claim was offered like a fact, and with no invitation. She was the keeper of the rules, no more, no less. They set work for him that first morning and every morning after. He split wood with a rhythm that came from years of fences and building frames. Splitting was honest business. Aim, swing, and the scent of sap and old heartwood. The log cracked open like a promise. He lifted water for the pots, buckets on a rope, and the muscle memory of men who had learned to make what is heavy lighter by repetition. He knelt to mend a leather strap that held a pannier. His fingers remembered the burn and the suture of a craftsman. The women watched the small things to see if his hands could be trusted by day. They set tests that were not in the form of questions but the daily economy that made a life sustainable. Asha had him work on a fence line above the cache where they kept dried meat. It was less about the fence and more about showing whether he would be careful with the things they considered sacred to survival. Nayali asked him to watch the smoking meat while she collected roots along a dry tributary. Watching meant staying awake, being present in the dull, reliable way that a person proves they can be counted on. Nomi asked him to climb the ridge and come back with news, a small errand that was as much about trust as it was about light-footedness. He did not always do the tests flawlessly. The first time he startled a rabbit into the brush and missed his shot, Asha's eyes narrowed. Not scorn, only measuring. She did not scold. She simply set him another way to prove himself. On the second morning he brought back a rabbit, singed at the edges but whole, and the women accepted it like a currency as valuable as a wound healed. He learned to carry things without showing the hollow beneath. He learned to tie knots without thinking about the loneliness those knots might someday bind. Between the work, there were small, raw quiets. Tayer would find himself watching them do things, how Nayali tended splinters with little songs that were not words but practicing the motion of care. how Asha steered Nomi like a helmsman guiding a fragile boat. How Nomi, in the privacy of the smoke, would let a smile leak out and then quickly catch it and still it. These were not displays of affection toward him in the obvious sense. They were domestic economies being reassembled in front of a man whose map showed no town where he could anchor. His grief did not vanish. Sometimes it lay over him thick as smoke and made him clumsy. He would be standing with an axe and see the image of a small bed where once a child had slept and know the weight of being the one left to move forward. He had promised himself, in the lonely hours after the funeral, never to put his heart where it could be taken without warning again. It had seemed safer to keep a hollowed space than to take the risk of being filled and emptied once more. The women, each in her way, did not disappoint. They asked what they needed to ask and did not demand the inner maps of his soul. Instead, they watched a man work, watched whether he laughed or cursed when things broke. They watched how he tended the fire in the long hours before dawn. When the wind grew sharp and the canyon sang with the sound of small stones rolling, the women measured whether he would stand with them and watch the rim or fall asleep with the helplessness that had once allowed loss to happen again. Trust was slow. Trust was not conferred in single gestures. It was a ledger kept by small, repeated transactions. The man brings water and the woman hands him bread. The woman shares a secret wound and the man ties a knot that will keep the shelter standing. The man passes his hand toward another's and finds it not withdrawn, but met. The slow accrual of these things began to change the angle of the world. Little increments, day upon day. There was a moment, midway through a week they had no names for, when Tayer sat on the lip of the canyon, cleaning a blade, and allowed himself to remember the voice of his wife, as if it were not betrayal to long for what had been taken. He saw again a pair of small boots lined by the hearth, a bowl with traces of stew, a hat left on the peg as if the man had only stepped out for a minute. The ache that came thereafter was the place where he had built new walls. He did not want to open them. He had lived with them so long that the thought of a new hand touching the mortar made his teeth ache. It was Nayali who noticed this tendency in him first, perhaps because she watched the way men kept grief like an object they hid in drawers, thinking it would not rust there. She sat near him one evening while he sharpened his knife, and she simply said, "You carry a long winter." It was not a question. It was a tentative recognition of kinship with a thing she herself knew, the wear of seasons on a body, and the way grief could grow like frost inside even the warmest of rooms. He told her a fragment, the fever, the quick closing of breath in a small bed, the sound of a child's wheeze, and then stopped, because speech is a blade and he did not want to hurt anyone further with its edge. Nayali only nodded. Later she would take a small cloth and place it over where his hands ached and say nothing. The gesture was permission enough. Asha, for all her bluntness, had another way of opening the question of life. She was pragmatic to the bone and despised wasted motion. "We make a day," she said one morning, listing tasks as if they were advantages to be shored up. "You can chop wood or you can watch the sky. Which will help the roof stay?" She did not ask him to become their man. She asked whether he would become a useful one. There was a clear difference in the ask. Usefulness was a thing a person could accept without selling the soul. The test that moved their relationship from hospitality to consideration of something else was quiet and domestic. During a storm, sudden, like a hand over the world, the canyon took itself in a hard breathing. Wind moved like sweeping hands. The roof of their small lean-to, patched and weighted with rocks, shuddered. Nayali's supply of cured roots that hung in a basket over the fire was threatened. The women moved like water into place. Asha braced the posts. Nomi fetched rope. Nayali saw the basket swinging and called for help. Tayer ran as if he had been made of the same sudden thought that struck the canyon. He climbed the low face, found the basket, and with the slow skill of a man who had handled livestock for years, steadied the weight and lashed it down. The three watched him with a look that had never been about charity. It was about calculation. He had not been a man who simply accepted. He was a man who volunteered muscle without proclamation. After the storm, as they sat by the damp fire, Asha said, "You could be useful." The words were blunt and careful. "You could stay." It was not an offer yet. It was a statement of possibility, handed across embers. Nomi, the youngest, stirred her cupped hands and watched the flame reflect in her pupils. She did not speak loudly. She said, "We are tired of sleeping with an eye on the rim." She did not plead, she offered a truth. Her voice was small but full of something like hunger that was human, not political, an appetite for the steadiness of hands that could be counted on when the night brought the sound of steps. Tayer's answer to this softened the canyon around his limbs. He did not say yes in that moment. He let the idea settle inside him like a stone into a pocket, feeling its weight against his thighs. He remembered his vow not to open again. He also felt something else that had not been present in the hard months since the fever took his family. A careful, almost practical yearning to belong to work and fire and hands that were not ghosts. Consent at this stage was not a single word. It was the conversation that evolved through labor and watching and mutual small kindnesses. A woman letting a man dry the dish she had washed, a man tying an extra knot on her pack so the rope would not fail. It was the slow mutual economy of people learning to trust one another again without the pressure of grand gestures, and it was always the women who set the boundaries. 3 days passed, and the ledger of trust filled with small victories. He had earned the right to sit by the inner circle of the fire where their smoke did not push him back. He learned the tune to a small song Nayali hummed when she stitched and hummed it back to her once, clumsy but brave. Nomi, who had rarely let anyone enter the private work of mending, handed him the needle and watched his hands with a mixture of amusement and relief. Asha began to tell him about the map of the canyon, where it hid pockets of water after a storm, where the sage grew fat with seed. She taught him in the smooth way of those who had to teach things that kept people alive. Wordless intimacies gathered. The way Nomi's hand brushed his forearm as she passed a bowl. Nayali setting a strip of cloth to his wound when he skinned his knee on a rock. Asha, awkward with tenderness but certain in provision, leaving him a warmed skin of beef for the morning when he woke first. None of it was theatrical, none of it was meant to entrap. It was the domestic making of a life again. On the 7th night, as they turned in, Asha said, quietly but with a precision that made the desert itself seem to lean in, "If you stay, you must sleep by the rim at night. Watch. You wake, you watch." It was not a demand of ownership, it was work. To watch the rim was to hold the line between life and the thunder of hooves that came with ill news. No one wanted to be the man to promise protection as if it were an absolute. Protection was a daily labor, a rotation of bodies, and a willingness to step into danger when the canyon called for it. He agreed to that much without thinking too much. He had been a rancher. He knew how to keep a night vigil better than any sentimental vow. He understood, in the way a man understands the heat of a particular tool, the necessity of being present in the small hours. And then the hoofbeat came. It was a single arcuate sound at first, like a small stone struck against a bigger one, and then more. Sound traveled differently up on the rim. When it shifted into a rhythm, 3, 4, a measure that made the breath halt, it was as if the canyon had decided on its next move and announced it in the only way it could, shadow on the lip of the world. They saw the horses before they saw riders, an outline of motion, a shape of dark against the skyline. The air seemed to sharpen to the edge of a knife. Asha moved without the hesitation they had learned to avoid. Her hand went for the rifle that was kept near the meat cache. Nayali picked up a pot and turned it as if it were a bell to be rung for chain reaction. Nomi pressed herself against the rock and watched like someone keeping a secret. "Riders," Nayali said, and it was not an accusation but an observation of the obvious. Tayer's hands tightened on the knife. The blood that kept him alive moved to the part of him that had been trained to meet danger in measured steps. The raiders, who they were, whether the same ones who had burned the houses or a different pack entirely, sat as a problem to solve. Nobody turned their face to the wind and wept for revenge. The desert required a steadier currency. Asha, who always spoke in matters of business and defense, told the men Tayer was not the only one who could be addressed indirectly. What she planned, a single warning shot, a man on the rim, a watch that would show whether they intended to pass or to threaten. Tayer felt the old code slide into place under his skin. He was offered, practically, a job. Watch the rim, stand as an eye on the lip of the canyon, make a decision if the threat neared. He thought, for half a breath, of the vow he had made not to let his heart be taken by the world again. The sound of hooves erased that promise as surely as a hand erases chalk. The throat clenched, decisions rose, and the canyon held its breath. He moved toward the ridge, his boot falls measured, the rifle weight in his hands like an extension of himself. Behind him the three women drew up against each other, not in a line of gendered roles but a ring of work and readiness. They had not been waiting for him to be a savior. They had been making themselves an economy of defense. His presence would only be one part of it. Still, as he climbed, he realized that something inside him had shifted. The shelter he had sought had become more than a roof for the night. It had become a place that needed tending and guarding. The sound of hooves grew, and the canyon's rim turned black with riders. He reached the edge and looked. Silhouettes moved along the ridge like a dark tide. There were 3 riders, the way the pattern repeated in a world that loved even numbers as easy stories. The sun had gone so far that even the sky could no longer soften their shapes. They were far enough to be considered threat or no threat, but close enough to cast those shadows that looked like hunger. Tayer put the rifle to his shoulder. He thought of the small bed, with 2 absent breaths, and of the way the 3 women had tested him, not for what he could promise in words, but for how his hands held up against labor and fear. He thought of the one-night shelter, of the pact that had been unspoken, and how quickly it had hardened into something that required defense. His finger curled around the trigger. He did not want to be a man who moved to save. He wanted, if anything, to be a man who kept his hands useful and honest. But in the small, plain calculus of the edge of the world, usefulness and protection were nearly the same thing. He raised the gun, aimed, and, just as he inhaled and prepared to send a warning through the canyon like thunder, the first horse stepped into a line of moonlight. Something changed in the shift of a shoulder, a flash of a wrapped scarf, a glint on the handled pommel. The rider lifted his hand as if to signal or to aim. The canyon flattened into 2 choices, fire or hold back. Behind him, a pebble of sound told him the women were watching with the same breathless attention with which the land watched the weather. Tayer squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the night like something breaking, and the ripple of sound landed along the rim. For a heartbeat, the world held its shape. Then a horse snorted, and the 3 riders drew back as if a line drawn in the air had told them not to cross. For now, the threat turned and folded. They did not ride away at a gallop. Instead, they moved off, a shadow of retreat that kept the question of tomorrow open. Down below, the 3 women released breaths they had not known they'd been holding. Nomi slid down from her rock and pressed her hand flat against his shoulder, where the rifle lay damp with the warmth of his palm. Nayali, as if calculating the ledger of a life, checked the fire and the meat and the rope, making sure the threads of survival were not frayed. Asha looked outward toward the lip where the riders had been, then back at him, and the ghost of a smile passed across her face, not one of flirtation, but the satisfaction of a plan that had worked. "You did well," Asha said. "There was no translation necessary for that." He nodded, feeling the residue of the rifle's recoil tremble in his shoulders. The canyon quieted into its usual noise of small things settling. They had not asked for his life or his heart. They had offered a shelter and, through the slow accounting of work and watchfulness, an opportunity to be part of the everyday economy of keeping a home. The firing of a gun had not made him a husband. It had only marked the edge of a new currency. He had defended them when a line in the sand had to be drawn. Later that night, as the fire burned low and embers moved like small worlds themselves, Asha spoke plainly. "We can protect ourselves," she said, "but it is easier if we have hands and eyes." She looked at him as if seeing the truth of him. No rescue narrative, no mystery of salvation. Only a man who might choose to stay and work and wake at the rim. Nomi reached for his hand, just once, and did not pull away. Nayali set a small cloth against his feet where the old wound ached and left it there without comment. Their gestures were not small in meaning. They were the slow building blocks of a life. They offered him the possibility of belonging without demand. They stated plainly that if he stayed, he would be one among a household of consenting adults. 3 women who had the decisive voice in the choice and a man with the choice to accept. Tayer sat there, pulse settling like water in a jar. The old promise not to open his heart struggled against a new practical desire. A desire for a place to put his hands each morning. A place where his labor had immediate and visible return. He thought of the boy who'd once curled against his side and the small physical truths that survived grief. Hands that learned to mend. Heat taken in a cold evening. A fire that is shared. He could leave in the morning. He could keep walking until the land forgot him. But the canyon had made its case. The shelter had become a situation that required tending. The women had done what people do when they want to gather life back together. They offered the possibility of shared duty and shared warmth. They had not asked him to take the name of husband in any formal way. They had simply opened a doorway that might lead, step by steady step, through the everyday tasks of feeding, watching, and sewing a life together. Outside the circle of the fire, the night was not entirely still. Somewhere on the ridge, the hoofbeat had not been fully silenced. Shadows touched the rim, moved off, and then returned. The sky beyond the canyon had the spare geometry of a place where other people made their own plans, and those plans sometimes included violence. Tayer moved to the edge of the lean-to and looked toward the rim where the riders had fallen back. The desert held 100 possible tomorrows. In some of them, the men would not return. In others, the riders would come back with more or with malice. He tightened his jaw and felt the pull to stand guard again. He was still only asking himself if he wanted to belong in the way these 3 women had offered. He had not answered aloud. The night pressed in. The fire popped and hissed. The canyon, patient as it was dangerous, seemed to wait to mark the shape of his decision. A shadow moved along the rim again, faint at first, then more present. The scent of the wind changed, carrying the metallic note of gun oil and the dryness of unshod country. A figure rode into the light and sat like a dark beetle on the skyline, head covered, face turned toward the little circle where 3 women and a wounded man held their breath. Tayer lifted the rifle a second time. The choice narrowed into the line of iron. He had sought shelter for one night. He had not, in his plans, meant to become a fixture in anyone's life. Yet here he stood at the rim, rifle up, the canyon opening around him with space for new commitments that had once been impossible to imagine. He thought of promises and of work, and of the small domestic things that could make surviving into living. He could feel the eyes behind him, and he could feel, in his own chest, the pull to be present. The rim of the canyon framed the approaching rider like a question. He steadied his breath, and the world reduced to the small calculus of one moment. Hold fire or let it speak. He held the rifle at the lip of the canyon, breath slow, and the world shoaled down to the dark curve of a shoulder, the dull gleam of a saddle horn, the hard line of a man who might be thinking to ride the canyon to ruin. The rider shifted, and for a moment there was the possibility of a conversation, some small parley that would keep horse and rider and the little life below intact. Tayer had learned, in other years, that the better part was often to speak first in the language men understood. Action. The trigger broke under his finger. The report split the night and rolled away along the rocks. The rider's silhouette flinched. A horse snorted and stamped, and the measure between passing and staying swung toward retreat. The 3 shapes on the rim drew back. For a long breath, the canyon hung between the 2 kinds of answers a man can give to danger. Meet it, or make of it, a story that teaches nothing. They left. Not the panicked gallop of cattle thieves, not the arrogant rush of men who meant to take and not look back. They slid away like shadows given permission. It was not a defeat, it was enough. Tayer kept his shoulder against the wind a moment longer, feeling the aftershudder of recoil, and the small private relief that someone else's plans had been checked. Behind him, hands moved, practical, swift. Nomi's fingers found his and did not pull away. The touch was quiet and whole, an answering promise that had nothing performative in it. They spoke little after that. There was no boasting, no false triumph. The 3 of them checked the lines, smoothed the tops, and walked the short perimeter in a way that was all business. Nayali counted the meat and the water as if reading a ledger in her head. Asha inspected the ridge beyond the cache and made notes by the lift of her chin. When they gathered again at the fire, embers were willing to take the words they needed. "You will have the rim tonight," Asha said. Her tone held the blunt coolness of someone for whom decisions are made by consequence, not feeling. "We rotate, we watch." "That is fair," he said. He did not offer a grand vow. He had learned that words could be less useful than duty. He had come to understand that an offer of one's waking hours counts for much when the world is lean. Asha reached into the meat skin and split a strip, handing it to him with a strict half-smile. "Eat," she said. "We speak in the morning." She did not say stay. The implication was there, but the decision was not hers to make alone. It had never been only hers. The three had argued, consulted, and weighed whether to open the circle. If there had been even a moment of doubt, the shot on the ridge had settled it into a kind of answer. They were capable of defending themselves, and it was easier to do so with an extra pair of hands that did not ask for dominion. Tayer ate slowly, feeling the food anchor him in the muscle of his jaw. The wound in his leg throbbed like a small timepiece. In the glow of the fire, he watched the three women do what kept them alive, stacking coals, smoothing fabric, fingering rope until it obeyed them. He had not yet decided whether he would sleep inside the circle tomorrow morning, whether he would answer to a name newly chosen, whether he would let the small domestic clocks of another life begin to keep him again. But the notion of leaving, of putting his boots back on and walking until his name was only a wind sound, had less pull now than the idea of making something with hands that had learned to trust. When the night closed, he took the rim watch. The wind came cold off the higher bench. It carried the smell of peppery sage, and beneath it, the thin metallic hint of iron. He sat with the rifle across his knees and kept his face to the horizon. There was a steady about him now that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with habit. He had done this kind of watch before. It did not permit the luxury of sentimental hesitation. When a shadow slid along the ridge and then another, he raised his head and listened, and then let the world decide if he would speak again with a voice of shot. Morning found them slow but whole. The animals grazed at a distance. The sun lifted like a promise that did not argue. At dawn's clean edge they gathered near the fire and did the predictable work of making a life safer. The lambskin was retanned, sheepskin wrapped tight, meat checked for pests, the cache lid weighed down. Asha looked at Tayer, and for the first time she used a word heavy with intention. "Stay," she said in Spanish at first, short, like a command, and then, in English, softer. "If you want to, we will not force you." Nayali watched him while she braided a bit of cord into a lanyard for the knife he carried. She had a way of making hands too old to be given cause to soften again. She made the practical into the tender without fanfare. Nomi, who had blushed when he had first reached for the cup, now stood taller. There was a small, bright determination in her, the kind that grows from months of mending and nights without the safety of numbers. The three women had not asked him because they pitied him. They had asked because the practical fact of the canyon demanded more hands, and because, perhaps in the slow measurement of wear, they had each found something in him they did not want to lose. "I can teach you to find the water pockets," Asha said after a beat. "You can teach us to split the larger logs. We move meat together. We watch in the same way we always have." He cupped his hands around the warm skin of fresh coffee, bitter and exactly right. The words that came into his mouth were not the grand admissions he had once imagined love would demand. They were small, honest things. "I can mend harness. I can keep a watch." "And what of your promise?" Nomi asked, surprisingly direct. Her voice lacked pretense. "You said you would not open again." The question lanced in him, as it should. He had said that after he had watched the fever take his son's breath. The vow had meant to protect him from the recreation of that loss. He had built a wall of dignity and solitude, but vows are not inert things, they are tested. Here, in a place of raw necessity and mutual care, vows could be reassessed in the light of new facts. "I made that vow out of a hurt I could not name," he said. "But I learned you can be a man who keeps his cord taut, and still will the rope that holds a house to not fray." He said it without flourish, and his words sank into the practical air around them. There was no romantic speech, no invented ceremony. Instead, they worked out a dozen small rules: who would keep the lighter cache on the east shelf, how the watches would rotate, how they would trade what they could to passers-by. They spoke about beds, more in terms of who would sleep where to keep watch than in terms of propriety. They spoke about children, cautiously, no immediate plans, only the agreement that if any child came into their life, it would be raised as all of theirs would be raised, together. Asha was the first to put a small sentence into the world that would become a name for what they were building. "We call ourselves wives," she said one morning, blunt as a tool, "because it is the simplest word. It says that this house has more than one heart keeping it." The word sat between them like a stone and then warmed. It was not a pronouncement of ownership or of a resigned concession to some old pattern. It was, in Asha's use of it, a practical label. Three women who chose, by their own hands, and not at the behest of another, to fold a man into their household as a partner. Nayali nodded at the phrase and added, "A name you give is a thing you have to live into. If we call it this, then we must make it mean what we want." They set conditions with a bone-dry precision. He would not claim their goods as his, and he would not speak for them. Disagreements would be settled in the same room where they cooked. Watches would be scheduled by consensus, and he would hold himself to the work he had been given, no more, no less. He would be a hand among hands. That naming, wife, spouse, partner, was theirs to give. He did not ask to be named. He listened and accepted. The first winter they shared was not gentle. It took shape as a succession of days heavy with work and small miracles, mending the lean-to so the drafts could not find a place to wedge in, saving every scrap of bone marrow for broth, patching the cache with extra hides, stacking the meat in a way that kept foxes from learning the smell. They hollowed a small garden alcove by the sun-warmed bench and coaxed a few stubborn seeds into sprout. It would not become a field. It would give them enough herbs and a few root vegetables to vary the meat-heavy meals of the canyon, and that was a kind of triumph. Tayer learned, in the rhythm of months, to speak with his hands as much as his mouth. He cut rails and set uprights. He learned where certain rocks, when stacked just so, would hold back the worst of the wind. He watched the women teach one another, and took his seat among them with the modesty of a man glad to be useful. He watched Asha negotiate with a passing trader for a spool of thread the size of his thumb. He watched Nayali lighten her voice when she sang to a brew that eased a cough. Nomi's smile came more often, and the scar at her mouth lost a little of its constancy, as she learned to laugh at foolish things the way people do when they have the leisure to be foolish. There were new intimacies, the press of a hand in the dark when a dream tore at one of them, the small ritual of passing a warmed skin to another in the first cold light of day, the way a braid is redone with fingers that move like a practiced prayer. Consent was woven through all these acts, explicit sometimes, unconscious at others, but always mutual and honored. When one night Nomi reached for Tayer's hand in the dark and, after a pause, rested her head against his shoulder for warmth, it was a choice that made sense because it was not demanded. Nayali, who had the unflappable tact of a woman who had braided grief and care into the same rope, wrapped a spare blanket around the two and hummed a small non-word song until the night's sharpness softened. Word of their household did not go out like a shouted herald. People used the rim and passed with eyes, saw the light in a canyon that had once lain empty, and began to remember that there are places you can find an honest trade. A lone muleteer stopped once and left a jar of molasses in exchange for a mended harness. A boy passing with a family gave them news of distant towns and the odd sorrowful rumors that travel brings. They accepted trade when it was fair and gave when they had extra. They did not ask for pity. Pity would have been a poverty of spirit. What they wanted was work and neighbors, not charity. Months passed in a manner like the passing of bread, measured, rhythmic, occasionally miraculous in the way a little extra helped on a day of lean. The canyon taught them how close survival and tenderness can be. Their relationship was never plotted as a romance in the novels of men who misunderstand weather. It was an arrangement of mutual labor and protection that, with patience, grew into something richer. Then, a spring that felt like the cusp of everything, the rim's shadow stretched wrong one evening. It came slower this time, a long ride, banners of dust on the wind. The three of them saw the pattern like they would read the sky for rain. These were not stray thieves. The number of horses meant a different problem. Asha felt it first in the set of a jaw, Nayali in the tightening of her hands around a pot. Nomi's eyes narrowed like a child's learning to read danger in a grown-up face. They prepared, quietly and with exactness. Tayer went to his station with the rifle and 3 bullets. He had kept the weapon oiled and clean. The women arranged their world to be less inviting to an unwanted animal. Trip lines of rope lifted to catch a stirrup, heated and steaming pans left in places they could make noise when kicked. A series of small beacons they could set alight to force the riders to think the canyon was not the simple prize they had counted on. When the riders reached the rim, they expected easy prey. A lean camp, a fire to snuff, a cache to take. They found people who had learned the shape of defense not in bravado but in craft. A pot overturned and clanged, a false fire set along a shelf of rock and then dropped into the wash so smoke would be seen from below. The first horse panicked at a line that tugged the stirrups. The iron bit of a roped snare frightened another, and the riders found their numbers turned against the particular geography of the canyon. In the confusion, men shouted like men who had misread the map of what they thought would be an easy attack. One rider did try to dismount and come down into the canyon on foot as if to meet a family in its own house. He was met by Nayali and Asha together, one with a club, the other with a steady, contained fury that is as much a tool as a blade. Nomi, smaller but quick, had followed a cunning path and cut the man's rein. The man, caught, argued and cursed in a sputter of sounds that had nothing to do with reason. Tayer held his rifle steady, but did not shoot to kill. The ripple of warning shots and the precise, unrelenting defense of the women made the band decide their spoils were not worth the difficulty. At the end of that day, no one among the four lay wounded beyond small bruises. No one had been made into a story to frighten children. The riders left with less than they had hoped, and the canyon exhaled like a lung that has held itself too long. The victory was not glorious, it was practical, and that made it a deeper, truer kind of binding. The women had not needed to be saved, they had needed to be counted on by a man who would stand as an equal in that moment, and he had done so. In the quiet afterward, as they tended scraped hands and checked the meat, there was a strange intimacy born out of danger, a recognition that life is worth building when you can trust others to answer the alarm with you. Asha, who rarely let sentiment pass her lips, poured a cup of coffee and pushed it toward Tayer across the same flat stone where earlier battles had been decided in the language of load-bearing. "We will not be easy to take," she said. "We will not be soft." He met her directly, the corner of his mouth lifting just enough. "Neither will I," he said. That evening the pact between them shifted into a kind of conscious covenant. They sat in the slow circle of firelight and spoke about what the canyon would need if they were to survive another season. More substantial caches, a better method to smoke meat, a line of warning on the ridge that would give them 10 long minutes warning. They argued like co-owners discussing a common field. They assigned roles. They planned for a childless future or for children who might come later. They spoke plainly that the lot of life in a canyon is lived in a thrumming present of necessity. "Then it is settled," Nayali said at last. Her voice had the steadiness of one who counts the ways to make a wound healable. "We are wives together. If any of us leave, it will be by choice and not by failing of duty." Asha set her jaw and nodded. "All decisions will be in the circle," she said. "No one speaks for another." Nomi, younger with a new tenacity braided into her, looked from face to face and added, "And when we quarrel about work, not hearts. We will not make a plaything of each other's grief." They all laughed softly at that, because only humor can keep grief from being the only language left. It was a laughter made of relief and an honest shared agreement. This household, however named, would be a place of consent and accountability. They had chosen each other, and they would live into the name they had given. Time, that slow artisan, worked its way over them. Seasons changed and marked them in small ways. Tayer's hair found more gray at the temple. Nomi's laughter deepened. Asha's hands grew more skilled at fixing what winter broke. Nayali's small remedies became the quiet backbone of the household, her poultices for small infections, her teas for coughs, her songs humbly offered like gentle stitches. They developed customs that were not invented as rituals, but as practical habits. The morning when Tayer would fill the water skins, the mid-afternoon when they would sit in a row and mend what the day had torn, the evening when they would take turns watching the rim and leave a cup warmed on the stone for the one who came off watch. On clear nights they would talk, the way people who have lived through loss do, about the things they had been, the terrible summers, the quiet mercies. Tayer told the smallest stories of his son, how he had liked to tap spoons together and make music, and sometimes his voice would drop and run away from him. The women, who had been left by their own losses, knew how to hold silence. They could keep a place open around him for the sound to land. Nayali would often put a hand on his shoulder, not to admonish but to allow the memory to be present without being a tyrant. Love, if it could be named in such a house, was not the melodrama of polished promises. It took the sober shapes of trust. A hand dried for someone who had been crying, a knife sharpened for the person who needed to skin a rabbit, a blanket shared when wind took the edge of warmth. There were nights when they slept with limbs tangled in ways that declared preference, and others when they asked for space and received it without reproach. Consent was constant. It was renewed daily, like the tending of coals. If there was jealousy or fear, they spoke it into the light and negotiated. There were no secret bargains. They preferred the slow honesty that works in a room where food is passed by the same hands who decide the firewood. During a long summer, a stranger came through who had news of a town at a day's ride where there might be a buyer for a hide. Asha considered riding out. The three women and Tayer discussed it like business partners. Who would go? Who would mind the cash? How to protect the place while their eyes were away. In the end, they went together, not as a man and women split by duty, but as a compact group whose trust had been tested by both weather and men who meant harm. They returned with more than a sail. The town had offered a child left behind by a family that had succumbed to fever, an orphaned boy with a mop of hair and a permanent wary look at the world. The four of them had argued and weighed whether to take him, considering their capacity and the danger of stretching already thin resources. But the child's small, searching eyes found them, and in a single meeting of mutual need, they decided to bring him into the canyon. The boy's presence changed the calculations of a household in the way a new roof changes the feel of a house. It found new uses, new vulnerabilities, and new laughter. Nomi learned to make the boy laugh with a small game of hide-and-seek among the rocks. Asha taught him the economy of stock and how to count spoils. Nayali gave him a name and a small charm of woven string. Tayer, who had been a father once and left with a hole the size of a horizon, found himself warming to the child with a steadiness that did not claim to be more than he could offer. Bread, mending, an honest laugh at a clumsy endeavor. The child was not a replacement. He was a presence that taught all of them how to divide love among the living. If someone had come by and said they had witnessed the impossible, a man who had wandered into a canyon and been taken as a man with 3 wives, the onlooker would not have been lying. That was exactly what had happened, but the story was poverty of truth if left at the headline. This household was not built on conquest or possession. It had been built by 3 survivors who had invited a man into their economy of life because he proved himself, and he had accepted a life that asked him for labor, patience, and the willingness to be one of many voices. They called each other wives because they found the word convenient and sturdy. In truth, whatever word anyone else might choose mattered less than the daily work of keeping the lean-to dry, the meat cured, and the boy's small lungs warm against a cough. They were partners in every sense that counted for the world they inhabited. The label was theirs and intended to mean shared labor, shared watch, shared hearth. Years folded into each other. The canyon thickened with their marks, a better patched roof, a line of stones that kept the worst of falling snow away from the door, a small alcove fenced against curious coyotes. The boy grew into a lad, then into a lanky youth who could climb the rim and spot a distant man on horseback as well as any scout. Tayer's leg never lost its ache, but his movements gained ease. Grief did not leave him, but was folded into the way he loved. The 3 women grew not into shadows of themselves beside a man, but into a domestic unit that refused to be described by any single standard. Each kept her independence, each had the deciding voice about her own person and the responsibilities the household required. There were visitors who came to the canyon years later, traders, passers-by, and once in a while a neighbor looking for seed or news. They often left surprised that 3 women ran the place with a man who was their equal, and that the boy had been raised by those 4 hands and taught to watch the world without being cruel. Asha's laugh had kept its practical edge. Nayali's hair now had threads of silver like a river braided with moonlight. Nomi's face, once quick to guard, had softened into an expression that welcomed a life made of shared labor and small joy. People told the story as they liked. Some made it into a tall tale of romance, others into an oddity about frontier habits. But the truth of their days was quieter. It was the clink of a spoon against a bowl, the smell of oiled leather, the hush that comes when an infant is being put to sleep, the precise planning of someone who knows the way to hide a cache from bolder hands. The canyon itself had changed, inasmuch as any place is marked by the people who live there. It had acquired the worn paths of feet that came and left, the small gardens that took root in improbable pockets, and a chorus of voices that spoke in the language of work. On a dawn much like the first one Tayer had watched from the rim, he stood with the 3 women on the lip of the canyon and looked out at the land that had nearly swallowed him with its loneliness the first time he passed. The boy, no longer a child, ran beside them with a rope and a grin, and the morning had that clear, bone-deep light the canyon kept for its precious things. Asha stood with her hands on her hips, the profile of someone who had always preferred to assess and act. Nayali's braid fell like a line of reasoning down her back, and her calm had the easy competence of a woman who had learned to stitch body and world together. Nomi leaned in the direction of the wind, as if listening for the sound of a hoof that would bring news and not calamity. Tayer folded his fingers over the rifle in a gesture that had become less emblematic and more ordinary, a tool among tools. They were quiet for a moment, not because they had nothing to say, but because the place beneath speech, duty, shared meals, mutual watches, said enough. Tayer thought of the old vow he had spoken in a different life and how it had not been a betrayal to break it. He had not relinquished memory. He had made room for a life that included both the remembered and the new. He had found that belonging was not an erasure of grief, but a way to carry it more lightly. "Who would have thought?" Nomi said, and the smile in her voice had the soft astonishment of one who had survived to be surprised, "that a man with empty pockets could keep 3 women." Asha snorted, a practical sound. "Not many men could have managed our work," she said. "But we did not take him because he was empty. We took him because he would hold the rope when the wind tried to steal the tarp." Nayali added, more tender than usual, "We made a home, and we keep it together." They stood there a long time, watching the sun lift and make the rocks into gold. The boy whistled and then ran to fetch a string of rope. The day's work awaited them all, and that was as it should be. They would return to the lean-to, to the tasks of mending and cooking and teaching the boy to read the sky. They would wake in turns and watch the rim and prepare for days when more strangers came, asking for trade or for shelter. The title that the outside world would later slap onto their story, "He sought shelter in Apache land and ended up with 3 wives," was not wrong. It was exactly what happened, yet it did not tell the whole truth. He had sought shelter and found a family formed of consent, of work, and of shared duty. He had ended up with 3 wives because 3 women chose to name the household so, and because he chose, as the equal of them, to stay. If you found their story moving, if the slow, true feel of frontier life spoke to you, like and share this tale. Tell us which corner of the frontier you want to see next.